Okay, so hi everyone. So today we're going to be continuing our ecology unit. So I know these previous classes we've discussed food chains, food webs, that's a bit of a review, but we also introduced stuff like trophic levels and invasive species and all that stuff. But today we're going to be going over these two concepts called biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So you may have seen on our class website that I posted this article for you all to read yesterday night. But if you haven't been able to read it, that's fine. I put a quick summary here. So this article basically talked about how pesticides impair our senses. So that can include stuff like our lack of smell. Some farmers even found that their vision was impaired for a little bit after using pesticides. But more common symptoms were like getting rashes and headaches. So obviously that's something we don't want to happen. On top of that, the article talked about how that eventually these pesticides end up in our human systems. So again, these pesticides are used to kill or get rid of pests, but we don't want that entering our body just because we're farming using pesticides. And lastly, they talked about natural or biology-based preventative measures to help our crops. So one of the examples that they had was nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And a farmer that used this method found that it worked just as well or even better than pesticides when it came to harvesting their crops and selling their crops. So now that we did a little review, we'll go over these questions. So hopefully you all might be able to answer these. So the first question I have for everyone is, what type of pesticide might be used instead?
So instead of the DBT, you mean?
Yeah, DDT.
Okay, maybe like a biological pesticide. I know there's like, to combat like caterpillars, sometimes they use viruses that attack the caterpillars, and then anything else that ingests the virus by accident might not, like they won't die, but the caterpillar will.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's actually a great example. We'll be kind of talking about that later on today, so that's awesome. Our second question, why do we use pesticides for crops? Pretty straightforward answer. Yeah, Austin?
To protect the crops from being eaten by bugs or other pests.
Yeah, exactly. So as farmers grow their crops, they obviously want to keep as much yield as possible, so they'll be able to make a profit. But if pests are decreasing the amount of crops that they're able to harvest, they won't be able to make a profit, and they won't be able to make a living. And our third question, outside of humans, what else might pesticides be affecting? Yep.
Like water systems, rivers, groundwater, soil, all of it can basically bioaccumulate. So the fish eats, drinks it, and I kind of use it too.
That's a great answer. That basically covered everything. So yeah, it can affect basically anything that it touches or anything that it can seep into. So that goes from the environment to even other animals. And lastly, if using non-pesticide preventive measures work, why do we still use pesticides? That might be a little tricky question. Yep.
Maybe pesticides are easier to access or easier to use.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, maybe the non-pesticide preventative measures are just more expensive.
Okay. You were going to say more expensive? Yeah, so there's a bunch of factors. Those are part of it for sure. Another part of it is just that a lot of farmers and a lot of big companies, they're just used to using pesticides. So they don't want to make the switch even though it may be better for them. Okay, good job everyone. Okay, so before we get on to that, we'll do a quick demo. So in the actual class, I'll probably have a group of everyone having their own set of cups and everything. But yeah, so in this cup over here, I have a bunch of marbles. And these marbles basically represent our producers. And in this case, we're going to be considering them as phytoplankton or seaweed. They're marbles because, unfortunately, they have been contaminated with some type of toxin, some type of pesticide. So now they're all brightly colored to represent that. And now we're going to be creating a little food chain or an energy pyramid. So at the very top, we have our human. And below that, we're going to have tuna, let's say. Below that, we're going to have a smaller fish that tuna may be eating. So it could be anything from like a little trout to just something even smaller than that. And these small cups over here, we're going to be considering them krill, because krill are little animals in the oceans and seas that eat phytoplankton or seaweed. Now, the krill one day, they were hungry, so they decided to eat lunch. But unfortunately, they didn't know that their lunch was contaminated with some toxins. So let's feed all of our krill. So each of them are going to get about 2 marbles. Okay. So everyone can see that they all got 2 marbles. Okay, they're all fed now. But now, on the same day or even a couple of days later, the smaller fish, which is our 3rd trophic level, they decided to eat lunch, and they're going to eat 2 krills each. So they're being fed now. Okay. So now our smaller fish has eaten the krill. And can anyone tell me how many marbles they have now? Yep.
4.
4. So the products of their toxins are increasing in their bodies. Now the tuna decides to have a big lunch and it's going to eat 2 smaller fishes. So tuna's eating now. And now we have our tuna. So how many marbles would be in here now?
8.
8, exactly. So we can see how the toxins are increasing over time as we go further and further up the food chain. The reason why we don't have a lot of animals or a lot of organisms in our higher trophic levels is because the ones on the bottom are smaller organisms, which means that they're more able to receive their resources and receive their nutrients more so than bigger organisms. And lastly, we have our human. So let's say our human went fishing one day or even just went to the grocery store and bought some tuna. Let's say they bought 2 tunas, so now they're eating the tuna. So how many marbles would the human have now?
16?
16, should be 16. So we can clearly see how even though the krill start off with only 2, as they were consumed up the food chain, the human at the end of the day got 16 units, let's say, of pesticide or of toxin. So this concept kind of goes into what we'll be discussing today, which is biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So now we'll just quickly go over these slides just to get over some definitions, and then we'll do a fun activity afterwards. So just so we all know what a pest is, it's harmful organisms that can destroy crops and reduce their yield or even cause disease. So some pests are even capable of killing the plants instead of just eating them. So that could be like a virus or a fungi, something like that. Interesting stat is that 30% of crops in Canada are actually destroyed by pests, and that's why pesticides have been used for a long time, because obviously 30% is a big portion of crops to be destroyed. Okay, so now what are pesticides? So they're used to kill pests or control the spread of disease. So most pesticides kill pests by interfering with their biological processes. So an example of a pesticide is called diatomaceous earth, and this kills insects by removing their waxy outer coating, which causes them to dehydrate. So with a lot of insects, they have this wax coating around their bodies, so the water inside of them won't evaporate, causing them to dehydrate. But if a pesticide removes that waxy coating, they would be susceptible to evaporation, causing them to dehydrate and just dry out and die. So what pesticides do we use nowadays and their allowed uses? So most pesticides nowadays are water soluble to reduce bioaccumulation. We'll go over what bioaccumulation means in a couple of slides. New pesticides can also break down easier. So this means that they won't be in our environments and in our ecosystems for a long time. after a while, they'll break down. Also, pesticides are not allowed to be used for cosmetic purposes for our own personal uses. So let's say we had a beautiful garden in our backyard. We're not allowed to use pesticides there, even though we may want to increase our crop yield. This is only meant for agricultural purposes and for big crops that provide for a lot of the community. And lastly, in general, pesticides have been reduced in agricultural. So even though crops are still being destroyed year to year, they're not being implemented as much as before. Okay, so how could we reduce the use of pesticides? So I know Austin mentioned one of these before. So one of them is biological control. So that can mean using predatory insects, mites, and disease-causing microorganisms. Another one is altered timing. So we may be able to plant our crops at a time when pests aren't at their peak population. So a lot of times different pests are more prominent in a certain ecosystem at a certain time, just because of their mating habits or just because of nutrient resources. Another one is crop rotation and mixed planting. So a lot of times farmers tend to switch where they plant crops just so the pests aren't used to where they're growing certain foods. So let's say you have corn in area A, maybe next year you'll plant them in area B, just so the pests that may have grown in area B or area A don't move to area B. Another one is baiting pests. So a lot of times we can use pheromone baits to trap pests and stop them from destroying our crops. And the last one is integrated pest management, which uses both organic and synthetic pest controlling methods. So now we'll go into what this whole lesson was about, which is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So these two terms sound very similar to each other. I personally get confused with them a bunch of times, but hopefully we'll be able to distinguish them better by the end of today. Bioaccumulation is the increase in concentration of a substance greater than the outside environment. So that may not make sense right now, but I have a diagram on the next slide that will hopefully make that more clear. And on the other hand, biomagnification is the increase in the concentration of a substance as it moves through a food chain. So the one thing to remember is that these terms don't only apply to pesticides and toxins. It also applies to positive things like nutrients, vitamins, essential fats, and amino acids. Okay, so this was the diagram I was mentioning. So on the top there is bioaccumulation. So we can see that as these organisms grow throughout their lifetime, their amount of toxins increases because they've been eating the same amount of food and those toxins that they're eating aren't breaking down. So as they get older, it accumulates more and more in their body. But on the other hand, biomagnification, which is kind of what the demo I was showing with the marbles was, as we go through the food chain, the levels of contamination increases just because more is being eaten by higher trophic levels. Okay, so for bioaccumulation to occur, the chemical must be long-lived, mobile, fat-soluble, and biologically active. So these are just all the factors that are needed for bioaccumulation to occur because these things allow the toxin to persist in the ecosystem. If one of these factors weren't part of this pesticide or part of this toxin, it would be possible to get rid of this before it causes any severe effects. Yeah, so those are just examples of humans trying to remove a pest. So I believe they're trying to get rid of oil from the sea. And that's just because if oil persists in the ocean, it will stay there forever. It will seep down and affect our corals and all things like that. So if humans don't interfere with that, it'll end up getting into our water supply, ends up getting into our fishes, and eventually into us. Yep. So fat soluble, so if the pesticide or the toxin, yep.
The oil that they're trying to get out of the ocean, is that because of leakages and sort of stuff, or is it because of other
So probably because of the leakage from like an oil shipment or just an oil rig. And so this chubby little baby, so that's just representing the fat-soluble pesticides or toxins. So usually what happens if a pesticide comes into our body, it lives in our fat. Just because over there, since it's fat-soluble, it'll be able to persist in there, but if it's soluble in water, our bodies would be able to get rid of it. And that just goes to show one of our nutrient or matter cycles, so that it'll persist in the cycle no matter what. And lastly, we'll just talk about DDT. This was mentioned in the article, but we'll just go over it again. So this is a classic example of a pesticide that was largely used in a lot of crops that humans invented. So DDT stands for dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. You won't be needed to memorize that. You can just live with DDT and you'll be fine. So it's not very toxic for humans, but it's super, super toxic for insects. The one issue with that, though, is that it was long-lived in the environment. So even if it didn't affect us directly, it affected the ecosystem where we sprayed the DDT. Okay. So that's the end of that slideshow. Now we're all going to break out in groups. So I'm not going to do this now, obviously. This is the end of the presentation. But we break up into groups. We'll do a jigsaw activity where you would all search up a certain pesticide, learn it on your own, and then come together and teach each other about that pesticide. But yeah, that's about it.